How to best build muscle with nutrition, and how much protein do you actually need? Let's dive in. Welcome to a Healthy Control podcast, providing education to create a healthy, balanced lifestyle, empowering you to take control of your health and not let health take control of you. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to have you here. In our last episode, we talked about how to maximize your training, how to get more out of it for the most muscle growth. Well, just like with fat loss, you can't outwork a bad diet. And we're going to dive into the controversial topic of how much protein do you need, when to consume it, types of proteins, and how to minimize muscle loss while dieting, and some very usable, applicable tips for your nutrition. Because let's face it, there is a lot of nutritional information out there, some good, some bad, some are somewhere in between. But before we get into that, let's take a quick second. Today's health class fact is that research has shown that maintaining strong social connections and having supportive social network can positively impact human longevity and health. Nutrition is important, exercise is important, but so is being social. Meaningful relationships and social engagement are linked to lower levels of stress, which makes sense. Improved mental well-being, again, less stress, you're going to feel better, you're going to think better, be more clear, and even have a reduced risk of chronic disease. Having a sense of community and spending time with friends and family not only enhances emotional resilience, but contributes to a longer and happier life. That is today's health class fact. Let's get into some nutrition here. I think the most controversial one is the one that makes sense to start with, and that's how much protein do you need per day? From my earliest memories of getting to the gym and actually focusing on nutrition and exercise, 1 gram of protein per body weight. That's just always been the gold standard. I think if you went to the gym and you asked 10 people, at least 5 would probably give you that answer. And also, guess who was never really able to consistently hit that number? Yeah, me. It's just a lot. I didn't feel like it was attainable, and it felt like such a chore, and it felt difficult to eat all that protein. We'll get into this a little bit later, but I didn't notice at the time, but having a 10-gram protein snack here and a 5-gram protein snack there, that doesn't count. It's not enough. There's a minimal base threshold you have to get over. So nickel and diming your way up to enough protein isn't actually beneficial. Over the years of reading research and kind of finding my own conclusion, which I'm not saying this is better or worse than anyone else. I don't have any studies on this. I'm not going to call it my method, but just what I've been doing. But I try to find what's a feasible protein requirement for the average person. And then that leads to the biggest issue that there's no one size fits all. Because Grandma Betty is going to need more protein because she's older, and Petunia, who is sedentary, doesn't need as much as Uncle Vernon, who's obese. And then your athletes are going to need a different amount too, and you see how it's complicated just to say 1 gram per body weight? Like, that's not the case here. So, in this episode today, I'm going to go through multiple sources and what they recommend. And I'm going to give my recommendation. I'm going to tell you guys what I've been doing, but you're presumably an adult or at least old enough to listen to a podcast, and ultimately you make your own decisions. So let's try and keep track here for all these different recommendations worldwide. So first of all, I don't know, from the gym, 1 gram per body weight. So there's recommendation number 1. Number 2, in the USA, the RDA, or the recommended dietary allowance, is 0.8 grams per body weight in kilos, which is also another issue. We're going to be talking about pounds and kilos, so I'm going to try to make it all the same. So 0.8 grams per kilo is about 0.36 grams per body weight. So about a third of what the gym says. The reference nutrient intake, which I believe is used in the UK, is 0.7 grams per kilogram, or about 0.34 grams per body weight in pounds. So the RDA and the RNI are roughly a third of a gram per body weight pounds. So there's 3 references. This next one's a little bit better. It's an international study, pretty long name, but they concluded that the daily protein requirement for healthy individuals over 65 years old is 1 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. 1 pound is about 2.2 kilos. So essentially, more or less, they're recommending about half a gram per body weight. That's a little bit more than what we just talked about, the RDA and the RNI. And then they also say if you have chronic illness, let's bump that up to about 0.54 to 0.68 grams per body weight, or 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilo. And if you have severe illnesses, injuries, or malnutrition issues, then about 2 grams per kilogram, which is about 0.9 grams per pound, or that's the closest we've got to that typical 1 gram per body weight. So through these 5 different recommendations, we have anywhere from 0.3 grams per body weight in pounds up to 0.9 grams per body weight in pounds. 4 minutes in, and what we have 3 blanket statements of here's how much you should have, and then 3 with a little more context to them mostly being older or sick. So this is why this question is so, I think, controversial and so difficult to answer, because it takes a little bit of customization to figure it out. Let's take a look at that last study real quick, though, and kind of get to the fundamentals of it. And it seems that the older you are and the more illness or poor nutrition you have, the more protein you need. From my understanding, this is to help mitigate muscle loss. It's an absolutely devastating thing watching people get old and get weaker to the point where they can't get off the couch on their own, or they can't walk anymore on their own. And then they get balance problems, and then they maybe have a fall, and things can quickly go downhill because they're not strong enough anymore for their own body weight. As a matter of fact, it's estimated that 0.5 to 1% of muscle mass is lost annually from age 50. That's not an old age, and at that point, we're already starting to lose a little bit of muscle mass. The study says this, and I completely agree that maybe even at a younger age, late 40s, even definitely 50s, start increasing your protein a little bit more. Now, another study looked at adults aged 70 to 79, and their daily protein intake was about 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight, and they lost 40% less lean body mass, which is in this case mostly muscle, over the course of 3 years than those who only consumed 0.5 gram of kilogram body weight, which 0.5 gram of kilogram body weight is 0.25-ish grams of body weight in pounds. So that's by far lower than any standard we've looked at, which makes sense that it's probably not the most ideal. So hopefully all these numbers are kind of making sense, but the older you get, you need protein to help mitigate muscle loss. Now, I know the primary audience here is not 65 years and older, so why are we talking about this so much? Well, mitigating muscle loss is one of our main goals when we're dieting, when we're trying to lose body fat. Because when you lose body fat, you're going to lose some muscle, usually. And when you gain muscle, you're going to gain some body fat. However, when we are dieting, when we do want to lose body fat, we're trying to mitigate that muscle loss as much as possible. Now, I do want to make this clear. You can do a body recomposition when you do gain muscle and lose fat at the same time. This is like the number one goal of every person brand new to health and fitness. They go into a gym, fill out an online survey. What do you want to do? I want to build muscle, lose fat. It's like, yeah, cool. We all do. There's certain parameters around who's actually able to do that, and that can only really take you so far. So those people, you have to either be obese or overweight, because you have such large storages of energy that it makes it possible to do this. You have to be more or less brand new to the gym, because the amount of stimulus your body needs in order to respond, the amount of weight you need to lift in order for your body to be like, oh crap, I've never done this before, we better get strong, is so little that that it's possible to do it. Or you need to be taking steroids or something of the likes of that. And then for most people, let's think about this. Let's say you're overweight and you're brand new to the gym and you start a body recomp and you see some changes happening. Eventually, you're no longer going to be overweight and you're no longer going to be new to the gym. So eventually you can't do your full dream physique because you're no longer in that body recomp, starting phase. It's somewhere where you can start, but eventually you have to abandon ship and prioritize your goals. You need to figure out and look at yourself honestly and say, do I want to build muscle now, or do I want to lose a little more fat? It's a super personal question, and really no one can answer it for you. the process that I go through when I'm trying to figure out which way I want to go, if I want to continue on a bulk or if I want to continue on a diet, is it's one of those things I look at myself in the mirror and think, I'm getting a little fluffy. I'm getting a little round. I'm getting a little puffy. All right, let's back off and let's cut a little bit. Or I'm looking at myself in the mirror thinking, I think I've done a pretty good job at this cut. I want to see my legs get bigger now. Or I'm just ready to start eating more again. It's a complete decision on your own, and it's whatever you feel comfortable and most confident in with your body. In either direction, it's not forever. You're not going to be dieting forever. You're not going to be bulking forever. And it's okay to say, I like where I'm at right here. I don't really want to bulk up. I don't really want to lose weight anymore. I just kind of want to stay here. And that's fair too. So when we're in those cutting phases, when we're trying to lose body fat, how can we best minimize the muscle loss? Protein is going to be a big part of it. Make sure you have enough. And we're still going to get to where we have not answered the question yet of how much protein do we need. We're still going to get there. So the study here, it looked at drug-free bodybuilders preparing for a show. And for those unaware, bodybuilders are trying to lose as much fat as possible while preserving the muscle mass so they look full and not like dry and flat. And also, they're not your typical person. Bodybuilders are typically driven to do whatever it takes to reach this physique. And also, they're athletes. Bodybuilders are athletes, and athletes are going to respond to nutrition and have different nutrition and training standards than the normal person does. With this group, they found that consuming 2.5 to 2.6 grams per kilogram during 11 weeks before composition had non-significant losses of fat-free mass. That means that they lost some fat-free mass or, muscle or things of that nature, but it didn't cross this statistical threshold to count. It's like if you had a measuring tape out and you're like, this is maybe 20 inches or maybe 20 and 1/16, somewhere in that range. That's what it means. You're kind of in that gray range. So this implies that more protein may be better. And for those following along, 2.5 to 2.6 grams per kilogram is actually more than 1 gram per body weight in pounds. But there were 2 participants in this group who lost a significant amount of fat-free mass, 1.5 and 1.8 kilograms, or about 3 to 4 pounds. And these 2 contestants were some of the leanest of the group and had the highest macro percentage, topping at 33% of their calories were coming from protein. So let's think about that. If you're one of the leanest, it's going to be harder to lose that fat. And then also they had relatively more protein than just about everyone else. The authors of the study suggested that potentially if they would have had increased their carbs instead of their protein up to 33%, it's possible they may not have lost as much fat-free mass. So the study suggests that there actually may be a ceiling on the protein levels, especially when protein is taking the place of fats or carbs. And this coincides with other research stating that the most powerful variable for fat-free mass loss, or the most powerful variable for muscle loss, is likely the magnitude of your calorie deficit, not your protein intake. If you are on a 2,000 calorie deficit diet, which is significant, you're going to lose a lot of body fat and you're going to lose a lot of muscle mass, even if only thing you're eating is protein. Some general consensus tips here is stay within a 500 calorie deficit, or at least start there. That is big enough that you're going to lose fat, but not too big to hopefully see this huge muscle loss. Create that deficit first from fats. Carbs and protein are both vitally important for muscle preservation. I'm not saying that fats aren't important, because they are. Don't let them dip below 20%, as that can have detrimental effects on hormonal health and subsequently fat-free mass. So if you're brand new, you've never dieted before, you've never done anything like that, take a week just to track where your calories are at, what your macros look like, and just see where you're at without affecting anything. Then get into a 500 calorie deficit, doing so by reducing your fats, but keeping it at least 20% of your macros. That's what I'm trying to say so far. So let's get into the protein requirements now. The leaner you are, the more protein you'll need. Athletes, 2.3 to 3.1 grams of fat-free mass, or 1.05 to 1.4 grams per body weight in pounds, seems to be the most consistently protective amount. The study also talked about those who are not as lean or who are concerned primarily with strength and performance versus maintenance of fat-free mass can go a little bit lower end of that recommendation or even below it. So, honestly, this is just my personal thought. Unless you're in the bodybuilding world or, something similar, we don't need to get that lean. Sure, you want to lose body fat. Sure, you want to look good with your shirt off. You don't need to be 4% body fat. So, yeah, the study says 3.1 grams per kilogram is the most protective against fat-free mass, but most people don't fall into that category because most of us are not that category of athlete trying to... Just because athletes do it doesn't mean that the normal population should do it. And if you have been dieting and you're like, man, I feel like something's missing, or I'm just missing out on something, or I need to improve something, I don't think skyrocketing your protein to 3 grams per body weight is probably the thing you need to do. There's probably something else that's going to make a much bigger impact in a healthier way that can be done. And finally, what should our goal weight be per week loss? Like, how much weight should we lose each week? From these studies, and it seems that 0.5 kilos per week, or about 0.7% total body mass, probably an even more important role than protein intake itself for preservation of fat-free mass. So yeah, maybe you could go up to 3 grams of protein per body weight, or you could just add some more carbs and slow down your weight loss a little bit. Fat loss and muscle loss is one of those high-risk, high-reward things. If you're going to lose body fat quickly, you're going to lose muscle mass too. If you slow down the process, you're going to slow down the muscle loss as well. So one more point I want to hit on before I get into kind of what I do and what my general recommendation is for protein. Although, don't take my word for it. I've given you like 7 different numbers. Kind of take all this information in and come to your own conclusion. But there's one more thing I want to really, really touch on here. Multiple places, multiple researchers touched on this, and I think it's vitally important to stress here. As long as you're in a negative energy balance, the macronutrient composition of a diet has no major impact on your weight loss. What does that mean? As long as you are burning more calories than you're eating, macros don't play that big of a role. If you're not losing weight, it's not because your macros are messed up. It's not because you haven't figured out the secret sauce. It's because you're consuming more calories than you're burning. Additionally, the Food for Me study showed that genotype dietary recommendations have no benefit on weight loss. That comes from those, I think there's like blood tests or something, and you submit your blood and it brings back and says, you should eat these foods, you should not eat those foods, blah, 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 based off of your DNA or something. No. Research shows that's not accurate. And another study supports that no evidence currently exists to validate the health benefits of blood type diets. This is another one, I think, maybe 20 years ago, something that popped up that if you're blood type B, you should eat these foods, and blood type A, 0 studies, 0 evidence exists that says that that's correct. Calories in, calories out. That is by far the most important thing to focus on. Not your genotypes, not your blood type, and not your macros to an extent. Having, quote unquote, the correct macros, but having too many calories is going to lead to fat gain. Being in a calorie deficit with a skewed macros is still going to lead to fat loss. What I do at my physique, or what I would do if I was overweight, is my body weight times 0.9 times fat-free mass percentage. In words, 1 gram of protein per 1 pound of fat-free mass minus 10%. I came to this number from mainly that last talking point of 2.3 to 3.1 grams of kilograms of fat-free mass. And this is so important. Fat-free mass, not total body weight. Fat is nowhere near as metabolically active as muscle and the rest of your body. And a 400-pound man who is 40% fat doesn't need 400 grams of protein. That is just a ridiculous amount. The times by 0.9 are reduced by 10%. is to actually make the overall number a little bit lower. Currently, I'm about 160 pounds, about probably 12% body fat or so. And I felt like for me, 140 grams of protein was just too much. If I can hit, body weight times 0.9 times fat-free mass, then I've probably had a good day of protein intake. Because, again, I'm not a world-class bodybuilder or professional athlete who has to do things at the most extremely perfect level. And odds are you're not either. So how do you find your fat-free mass percentage? This is super easy. Sure, you can get a body scan, you can get some fat calibers or a scale, which scales are usually pretty shoddy on accuracy, so don't rely on them. When I was in college, I had a bod pod, which is supposed to be pretty accurate, and it popped me up at like sub 5%, which I was pretty damn lean at that time, but I don't think it was sub 5. My at-home scale had me at like 8%. So, again, 3%, not that big of a difference. Even easier, just go look in the mirror. So Google this phrase, body fat percentage mirror. And then look at yourself in a mirror. And when you do that, you're going to find a lot of pictures that show this is what 4%, this is what 8%, 12, 20, 30, 40, 50% body fat looks like. Now you go to your own mirror with that picture, and you see which one you kind of line up with best. Yes, it's a rough estimate, but at the end of the day, if you're 22 versus 24% body fat, that's not that big of a difference. It's really not. That's like 7 grams of protein. Like, don't stress that hard over something that's not vitally important. Because, I don't know if you know this, but the FDA allows for a 20% variance on nutritional labels. So, stressing about 2% body fat isn't going to matter. So that's what I do. Body weight in pounds times 0.9 times fat-free mass. And that gets me a pretty attainable and sustainable protein requirement that I can hit. And it helps. I've gained quite a bit of muscle mass over the years. Is it the most accurate? Probably not. Is there a better recommendation? Probably. But like I've been saying, there's so many different recommendations based on who you are. And I think we often get too caught up in the weeds trying to figure out what that perfect amount is. And I think it can be extremely discouraging thinking you need 200 grams of protein and you're stuck at 90. And it's like, why try? I can't even get to 200. And that's one of the big faults of you need more protein, you need more protein, you need more protein. It's like you need more protein compared to what or to whom? If you're talking about the group we talked about earlier, who was 70 years old and eating 0.2 grams of protein per body weight, yeah, you need more protein. If you're talking about the group who gets over 1 gram per body weight, you probably don't need more protein. Protein is not the end-all, be-all. So, hopefully by now you know roughly how much to consume. You know roughly how much protein you need. But as I talked about earlier, we can't just nickel and dime it. So when should you consume that protein? Let's get to that after the break. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I have one request of you. I'm looking to answer your questions. I have 2 categories here. I want questions that can be answered in a couple minutes. And then I want questions that maybe are going to take a little bit more time, possibly a whole episode. You can submit your questions to ahealthycontrol@gmail.com. Thank you and enjoy the rest of today's episode. All right, so I alluded to this earlier, but when we consume protein, there is a floor amount that we have to hit in order to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So unfortunately, if you have a candy bar with the label protein on it, or I think cereal or stuff like that, it's not doing a whole lot for you. It's estimated, keep that in mind, estimated that 2 to 3 meals of 25 to 30 grams of high quality protein is optimal. And this is another reason why I always question those 1 gram of protein per body weight people, because it's apparently optimal for 2 to 3 meals of 25 to 30 grams of protein. which on the high end is 90 grams. But some people are supposed to eat 200 grams. So there's always that conflicting research out there. But what they're really trying to get at here with this optimal range is that there's a floor and there's a ceiling to how much protein we can utilize at once. Is it bad to go above the ceiling? Yes and no. I mean, it's still calories, so it can still increase your body fat. But it's one of those things, if you're within your overall calorie mark and you hit your carb and fat requirements, if you have a little extra protein per meal, it's not the worst in the world. On this subject of the high quality protein, one question that was submitted was, what's the difference between complete and incomplete protein sources? There are 9 amino acids that we can only get through protein. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Animal sources contain all 9 of those, where plant sources do not contain all 9, and therefore they're considered incomplete protein. This does not mean that they are worse protein sources than complete protein. They're just incomplete. From my understanding on this subject, if you eat a variety of vegetarian sources, you're going to get all 9 amino acids in there, and it's completely fine. So although their name is incomplete, that doesn't mean they count as less protein. Back to the floor and the ceiling of protein, trying to figure out how much to eat at once and when to eat it. 2 studies here looked at 2 different age groups. First one looked at 22-year-old males and 70-year-old males. The 22-year-old males consumed 0.24 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, and a 70-year-old group consumed 0.4 grams of kilogram body weight. That's roughly 16 grams for a 150-pound 22-year-old and 27 grams for a 70-year-old. That was the threshold or the minimum those age groups needed to consume. Another study compared the effects of 30 grams of protein per meal to 90 grams of protein per meal in 35-year-olds and 68-year-olds, and they found no benefit from the increased protein consumption. They tripled the protein, and it did not matter. One more study here looks at the effects of women in their late 60s. One group had 79% of their protein at noon. That's a lot. And then they had 7 to 14% at breakfast and dinner. They had improved protein utilization than the group that spread out protein evenly through the 4 meals, which I did not expect to find. Because the prior study said, spread it out, too much is not better. However, with these women that had their protein in 4 different meals, none of those meals exceeded 25 grams of protein. So it's possible they never just met that threshold that they needed, which is why they had worse protein utilization than the group that more or less just had one giant protein meal. I think it's safe to conclude that there is a minimum. There's for sure a minimum protein how much you need, possibly 20, 25 grams, in order to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And then at some point, there's a ceiling where more protein is not going to do anything more for you. Now, personally, would I rather flirt with the floor where it's like, am I even going to activate any muscle protein synthesis? Or do I want to flirt with the ceiling where it's like, I for sure hit it and I may have a little bit extra? That's a personal call for you. I also think it's important to understand that spreading it out throughout the day, hitting your minimal threshold is probably the best. We have another listener submitted question here that goes right along with this, is that should we have protein before bed? Now, this is something I heard when I first started working on everything, is that you should drink a casein shake before you go to bed because it's slow digesting. You'll muscle protein synthesis overnight, and it's good for you. Well, is that true? In recent studies, we saw that having 20 to 40 grams of protein before bed leads to appropriate protein digestion and amino acid absorption in younger and healthier adults, which that's great. But then it got me thinking about sleep quality, because, little spoiler here, there's a whole episode coming up about sleep quality, so it's kind of forefront of mind. So I was wondering, if I ate late at night, is it going to affect my sleep quality, and is it going to affect how hungry I am the next day? Am I still going to be able to want or eat breakfast? And if not, I'm more or less just kind of trading one meal for another. I'm not really adding anything if I'm going to skip breakfast. So the study says, our studies have shown no effect on pre-sleep protein ingestion on sleep onset latency, which is how long it takes you to fall asleep, sleep quality, and or next morning appetite in young and older individuals. As such, pre-sleep protein ingestion can be considered an additional meal moment to increase total daily protein intake and improve overnight protein balance. So, we can have our cake and eat it too, especially if it's a protein cake. Which this led me to another question. As I mentioned earlier, growing up, I was taught you should have casein before you go to bed. So, does it need to be casein or can it be whey? Now, whey is usually sold as a concentrate or an isolate. It digests faster than casein, which takes about 3 or 4 hours. Isolate is more filtered than concentrate and only has 1% of lactose. So for those who are lactose intolerant, look for a whey isolate. And I found 2 studies that aim to answer this question, whey or casein. First study was pretty simple. It said it does not matter between whey and casein protein. The second study had 4 groups, 2 groups with either 24 or 48 grams of protein, and then the 2 groups had either whey or casein. And only the 48 grams of casein elicited favorable changes in your morning resting metabolic rate, with only tiny changes in exercise performance. This is my bias here, but I think at the end of the day, it really does not matter. Maybe selling casein was just another marketing ploy to get you to buy one more thing. I don't know. If you have casein, sure, use it. I'll just say I've been taking supplements for like 10 years and I've bought 0 tubs of casein. I feel like I have thrown a lot of numbers out today, and I want to try to summarize this cleanly at the end here. First of all, calories are king. Make sure you're in a small but appropriate calorie deficit. And until you can master that, don't worry too much about your macro splits. Once you can consistently hit your calories, now it's time to take it to the next level and make sure you're at least 20% fat. Protein, somewhere in there, and then carbs are the rest. So protein, if you're overweight or you want to lose a little bit of body fat, trim up the last little bit. What I would do if I was overweight, body weight times fat-free mass percentage times 0.9. And that's how many grams of protein I would get. So I weigh 160 pounds, so 160 times my fat-free mass percentage, which let's say I'm 12% fat mass, so that'd be 160 times 0.88 and then times 0.09, which would give me 127 grams of protein per day. If you can hit your 20% fat and you're, an athlete, you're competing for something, you have years of training behind you, relatively less fat to lose, maybe 2.3 to 3 grams of fat-free mass might be a little bit more appropriate. And then if you are someone maybe you're responsible for or just love is elderly, make sure they're getting at least 0.5 grams of body weight in pounds up to 1 gram per pound per body weight. I'm going to be honest, elderly people generally do not eat a whole lot, especially in one sitting. So trying to get them to eat 150 grams of protein maybe won't be feasible, but at least 0.5 grams of protein for the elderly. As you start to approach age 50, consider increasing your protein to help mitigate fat-free mass loss. And lastly, it's better to spread your protein out as long as you hit that minimum threshold, and more is not always better in one sitting. I hope you feel empowered to take control of your nutrition to help get that physique that you're wanting, whether you want to just lose a little bit of fat or want to look like a Greek god. Thank you for listening to A Healthy Control podcast. You can find us at YouTube at A Healthy Control and make sure to subscribe. You can also reach me at ahealthycontrol@gmail.com with any comments or questions you'd like answered on the show. Reminder, A Healthy Control podcast is for entertainment purposes only and not in lieu of any medical advice. If you have any concerns about your health, please speak to a healthcare provider.